So, last time we talked, I talked about the decree of God, and I talked about the sovereignty of God, and I really wanted you to kind of understand that doctrine. Because once you start to realize that God has literally decreed everything, it's just phenomenal. And it's okay if you don't remember the definition. So let me read it to you so you can remember. God's decree. And this is from Louis Berkhoff, by the way, his systematic theology. But Berkhoff says this, and when Berkhoff is saying all of this, he's basically talking about God's decree, but he's going off of Reformation information back. But he writes it down, and I was following what he said. So let me just quote him. But Berkhoff defines it this way: God's decree. His eternal purpose, according to the counsel of his own will, whereby, for his own glory, he hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. That's phenomenal. The counsel of his own will, for his own glory, he foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. Now, I told you that last time, so I'm not going to go a lot into that because I don't want to reteach it. But I do want to tell you this today, because this is phenomenal, and this is the providence of God. If you've got the decree of God, you've got what God did in eternity past, before time even started. God was already surmising in his own mind what was going to happen. He was already planning it out. But then you have, that's eternity past, but then you have God's providence. And God's providence is the here and now. It's not just looking to the heavens, but it's actually looking and explaining what God is doing in the here and now on earth. Now listen to this. God's providence. That continued exercise of the divine energy, whereby the Creator preserves all of his creatures, is operative in all that comes to pass in the world, and directs all things to their appointed end. Does that make sense? Do you get that? So the continued exercise of the divine energy, whereby the Creator preserves all of his creatures, is operative in all that comes to pass in the world, and directs all things to their appointed end. So that's just amazing. And when you think about that, you think about the decree of God, wow, eternity past. Then you think about God's providence and everything that's happening in the world. It's happening because he decreed it in eternity past. That's the heavenly realm. And then you have the earthly realm that God is directing it all. It's really amazing. Oh, wow. Why do I start that way? You know why? That's refreshing to me. I just love that. That God is behind everything, you guys. Wow. He's behind everything. That's how we can face our trials with joy. No matter what it is, we can face our trials with joy because we know the God that's behind it all. Now, I told you this last time because we're going through the book, A Thirst for Wholeness, and we're going through the chapters, and I told you this last time just to remind you, and I'll do that a few times because I just want you to keep it in your mind, that God, even though we're talking about, because Jay Adams is talking about James chapter 1, or the book of James, but God, and I told you this last time, God does not command you or me to feel joyful. It's not what he does. He doesn't say, hey, be joyful. It's not what he's doing. What God is doing is commanding you and me to think, and to control what we think and lead our thoughts to the proper biblical considerations. Whew. That's Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute or good report, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. That's what he's talking about. So basically, God doesn't command you to feel joyful. I told you that last time. I'm telling you again, so you don't feel guilty, thinking, man, God keeps commanding me to feel joyful and I don't feel it. No, that's not what it is. He commands you to control your thinking. All right. Jay Adams, let me quote something he says. This, about leading your thoughts, he says, this does not just happen. And I told you this before. He says, it takes a deliberate act to wrench your mind out of the pagan cesspool of thought into which you have allowed it to wade, end quote. That was page 18. So you say, okay, got it. But it's super hard. Yes, it is. We'll talk about that. But just remember, you guys, everything we're talking about, these are all muscles. Compared to like a muscle, it takes time to build. You don't just start with 100 pounds or whatever you're trying to think about in an accident. Or an exercise. You start small, and that it's a muscle you got to train. Okay, so for today, keeping going on, I'm going to give you some points, okay? Because I don't know how to do this without having some structure. The structure helps me, so I don't just go off and talk off the top of my head and go down all these rabbit trails. So let me give you a point. Point number 1. The verse is James 2, James 1:2. And we talked about this a little bit before, and I'm not being apologetic again when I say that, but I just want to make sure that you got it. So let me just make some comments that I don't think I made before. Point number 1, be positive. And I'm not being, a positive thinker only, but the point number 1, be positive about your trial. Be positive about your trial. Really? Yes. About your trials. James 1:2, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. We talked about this before. Some of you remember, and maybe you don't. If you don't, it's okay. But when I first got in my business, my business, I was reading a lot of positive thinking stuff. And I remember my favorite guy when I became a Christian was Zig Ziglar. You guys know that name, Zig Ziglar? Zig Ziglar, he was just the greatest. In fact, I actually went and saw Zig Ziglar in Dallas to his seminar in, I think it was 1989. And I got to have lunch with him, not because he and I went to lunch on our own. No, everybody at the seminar. But I got to sit at the table with Zig. And Zig always had a way of saying, he called it stinking thinking. And that's the way it is. And when James is saying this, to be positive about your trials, it makes me think of what Zig would say, take care of stinking thinking. Get rid of it. And that's what James is doing. He talks about literally consider it all joy. And I told you this before, I'll tell you it again. Literally, he takes the all joy part in the Greek language and he moves it to the front, which is his way of emphasizing and highlighting and underlining. So literally he's saying all joy, think it, my brethren. And it's amazing. We got to be positive about our trials. And God commands us to lead our thoughts and to be leading our thoughts toward righteous considerations. Now, let me quote Jay Adams. He says something on page 21. He says this. Talking about God. He says he knew they needed straight talk. He's talking about James, talking to his readers. And Jay Adams writes, he knew they needed straight talk. James wants to awaken you from the outset to the importance of the right attitude toward all the problems he will write about in his letter. He wants to sweep aside self-pity, discouragement, anger, or anything else that would keep you, or me, that would keep you from considering reality for what it really is. And then Jay Adams finishes by saying, the only way that will happen is for you to begin with the proper godly perspective on trouble, no matter how much it hurts, end quote. Isn't that true? You guys, we can all just be honest. We don't always have the best attitude. And some of us, in Christians, it happens with Christians, we can be really negative. And sometimes we don't realize how negative we are until somebody confronts us on it. We don't realize how much we say that doesn't really edify. Ephesians 4:29. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth. But we can be really, really negative people. And if you're a negative person, not that you're trying to be, but you might already have the habit of being negative. Why? Because you have habits from your pre-Christian days. And maybe some of these habits are habits you have not sanctified and put off. I know I'm working on that all the time. It's part of my sanctification. But ask yourself, is that you? Are you negative? Are you the kind of person that would brighten up a room just by leaving it? We don't want to be like that. We want to be positive people. And I'm not talking Norman Vincent Peale, a power of positive thinking. No, I'm not talking that. I read all those books. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being biblical. I'm talking about being biblical. By the way, the Bible never commands you to pity yourself. Because so many times we can get caught up in self-pity. We can get wrapped up in self-pity. And the Bible never says that we should pity ourselves, ever. Why? Self-pity is self-centered. If I start to think of my own troubles, and look, I'm no better than anybody else. If I start to really think about my own stuff that I got to go through, I'm gonna start licking my wounds because it's gonna hurt, and I'm gonna get caught in self-pity. But for me to do what Jay Adams is talking about, or what James is talking about, I got to go away from that completely. I gotta be positive in my trials as much as I can, because there's nothing positive, if you don't mind me saying it this way, there's nothing positive about being negative. Not at all. But that's kind of why I feel like we need to start to learn theology more. And maybe you're not doing that. And okay, I get it. We're human. But maybe that's one of the ways the Lord is trying to lovingly remind you that we need to start deepening our theology. Because it's in our theology where we find the rest. We find the proper conviction, the proper thinking. Like this, listen to this. Psalm 119, that great psalm, super long, a beautiful psalm, written with each different stanzas, starts with a Hebrew letter, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Hey, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samach, Ayin, Pei, Tzadi, Kof, Resh, Shin, Tau. That's the Hebrew alphabet. And if you look, you see in your English Bible, it'll say all of the different letters, because that's that part of Psalm 119, that actually every word in that part of the chapter, it starts with that word. But anyway, sorry if that's too much, but here's what the psalmist writes in Psalm 119 in verse 11. And he says, "Thy word I have treasured in my heart, that I may not sin against you." And maybe that's something you need to do. I'm talking about going deep. Maybe that's something you can memorize. I mean, maybe that's something you can do. The word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. We talked about that last time, Hebrews 4:12. That's very helpful. So anyways, the first point, being positive about your trials, the all joy, literally James writes, it's unmixed joy. It's pure, complete joy. It's not 60-40. It's not 60% joy and 40, no, it's, James is thinking all joy, complete pure joy. Now I want to talk, we're going to have some Q&A at the end because I have it written down. But there are some things that happen in life that are super weird and super hard. I get that. I get that. And it would sound pretty stupid if I ever heard somebody thinking we should all think joyfully about it. Well, that's where the theology comes in, and I'll mention that because I want to make sure I always talk about that. But the first point, be positive about your trials. Secondly, and this is great, thinking joyfully, you know what it does? It produces endurance. Endurance. Hupomeno. What does that mean? It just is it's a Greek word that means literally to remain under. So you can picture it like this. I don't know what the Olympic thing is in weightlifting, but you know those guys or girls, whatever, they take this big bar with weight and they lift it up and then they're holding it and they hold it and they hold it and then they drop it. That's remaining under. When God gives you a trial, when God gives me a trial, what's he doing? He's making us like Christ. And endurance is the ability, it's what God is producing, to be able to remain under it. That's what James says, verse 3. Knowing that, consider it all joy. And then in verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, the ability to hang in there. And then James says, verse 4, and let endurance, this is another command. This is the second command. The first command of James was consider it all joy. The second command is right here in verse 4, and let endurance have its perfect result, or its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. You know what God does, you guys? And this is important to know. James is testing you. James is testing me. What's he testing? The validity of our faith. The validity of our faith. That's why the book seems so hard. That's why James writes the way he writes. Because God wants endurance to be produced in our life. That's just amazing. He wants to produce endurance. God is wanting to produce through our trials, and that's all J. Adams is talking about. He wants to produce our ability to hang in there. Wouldn't you like that? And the more we go through as a continual process, because it never stops, does it? The more we go through, and then we cry, and we do all we do, which is, I mean, I'm human, we do it. But we get to a point where our endurance is starting to be built, and we're ready to move forward. And we don't want to sit in the back. We don't want to complain. We just want to move forward. And that's where God is trying to get us to go. Think about it. And this makes me laugh when I think about myself, even thinking of it this way. Do you honestly think becoming like Jesus Christ would be easy? Never. It's obviously very hard. It takes the work of the Spirit of God. If it wasn't for the Spirit of God, we wouldn't be able to do it at all. But it's a very difficult thing. But what God is doing is he's wanting us to remain in the trial. He's wanting us to consider it all joy so we don't get off track. He's wanting us, through our joyful consideration of what God is doing, remembering that God is completely in the trial with us. He's not abandoning us, throwing us in it, and letting us be alone and abandoned in it. He's producing endurance, and that's exactly what he's saying. In fact, this is interesting. Romans 8:29, you guys know that. If I've talked to any of you, I've told you this a million times probably. But Romans 8:29, that's what God is doing. He's preparing us. He's conforming us into the image of Jesus Christ. But think about this. Listen to this, because maybe you're saying to yourself, this is really hard. Oh, I get it. Oh, trust me, I get it as much as you do. But listen to what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6. And this is great because Paul is writing, well, I'll keep on the point. Sometimes I feel like when I'm talking, I'll start going off, telling you more background than you probably want to know. But listen to 1 Timothy 6. Paul says this, 1 Timothy 6, verse 6. He says, but godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. Wow. So godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. And then he says this, verse 7. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. And then in verse 8, if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. Isn't that amazing? When I read Paul like that, or I think about what we're talking about now, considering trials to be joyful, and it sounds so stupid, but it's not stupid. The bottom line is we have to ask ourselves, and this is why God brings us through these things. We have to ask ourselves, what's my goal? What's my goal? Is my goal really to be like Jesus Christ? Because if my goal is to be like Christ, then when the trial comes, through my tears, yes, I get it, through my frustration, through my anger, whatever it is, we're human. But I'm going to start to question, what am I after? Am I really content? Content with what? Content with the will of God. Right? God is sovereign. If God has decreed everything, and God is producing everything through his providence, I'm going to be content. I'm going to be content. I'm going to be content in Jesus Christ. Even if it doesn't make sense to me. Why this, why that? But I've said it before. It's not always going to make sense. It's rarely ever going to make sense. Did it make sense to Job? No. Did the writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, did it make sense to Solomon? Remember everything Solomon went through? No, it Didn't make sense to him. That's why he started Ecclesiastes saying it's all vanity. It's all useless. It's pointless. And then he gets to the end of Ecclesiastes and he finally wraps it up and says, wow, God, all we got to do is keep your commandments. All we got to do is keep your commandments. Doesn't that encourage you to hear that? I know your day is hard. Your day might have been great today, bad yesterday. I don't know. We all have different days. Oh, man. All we have to do is keep his commandments. All we have to do is to train ourselves to think properly and let everything else go. Just let it go. That's what God is doing. That's what God is doing. Thinking joyfully about your trial strengthens your endurance. Number one, because you're being obedient. All joy deem it when you encounter various trials. So you're obeying that command. And then you're even knowing, verse 3, that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Knowing, gnosko, that word, it's not just factual, it's experiential, the way James is writing that. It's knowing it. Experientially knowing it. It's amazing. So amazing. Listen to what Paul says in Romans 5:3. In Romans 5:3, Paul writes, we exult, we rejoice, we exult in our tribulations. I love that. We exult in our success. That's not what he says. We exult in our tribulations. Knowing that, same idea, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance. That's hupomeno, that's the same idea. And perseverance, Paul says in Romans 5, perseverance, proven character. Wow. And proven character, hope. Hope. Don't you want more hope? Don't you want more hope? It's so amazing. God is building in your life hope. God is building in your life through these trials that you are so mad about. It's so frustrating. I get it too. But God is building in our life the ability to endure, the ability to hang in there, the ability to have proven character that brings hope. Wow. Don't you want to live as a light in the midst of darkness? Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. It's so amazing. Being positive about our trials, thinking joyfully, because it strengthens endurance. One more verse, by the way, that you need to think about. Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews, we don't really totally know who that was who wrote Hebrews, by the way. Some say Paul. I don't know. Either way, it doesn't matter. It matters, but I don't know. But Paul, or the writer says in Hebrews 12:1, he says, run with endurance the race that is set before us. Which is interesting about this in Romans 12:1 and 2. He says, running with endurance the race. It's easy to understand, isn't it? To race. You know the Greek word he used for race there? It's a Greek word called agon. You know we get another English word from agon. Agony. The writer of Hebrews is saying, run with endurance, the race, the agony. It is hard. It is hard. All right, so we be being positive about our trials, thinking joyfully because it strengthens our endurance. And then thirdly, lastly, stay in. Stay in. Really? Stay in. Unfortunately, so many times people can be quitters. We've all been there before. But James wants us to, and Jay Adams talks about it, we cannot be quitters. That's why verse 4 of James 1 says, let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Perfect. Doesn't mean without sin. Doesn't mean that at all. It means literally maturing in virtue. Perfect. Complete. Why would James say that? Complete. You know what? When they were supposed to sacrifice animals in the Old Testament, you didn't come and bring a three-legged animal. You couldn't sacrifice a three-legged animal if it needed four legs. It would be a very unworthy thing to sacrifice to God. Complete. It's literally having all of its parts. So what James is saying, let endurance have its perfect result, that you would be perfect and complete, not lacking anything. Which is exactly what he says next. Jay Adams says this. Let me quote it. It's page 23 and 24. And if you have your book, I'm just telling you the pages so you can always look at it. On page 23, he says, faith is strengthened by handling trials God's way. New sentence. In many smaller trials, those Christians failed to grow. They handled the trials wrongly. When the time came to stand firm, they failed. Page 23. And then Jay Adams writes this, later down on the page. God is preparing you for days to come. And then he says this. Every trial, if God cuts the trial short, fine. If you cut it short by following God's directions, in other words, by being obedient, if you cut the trial short by following God's directions, fine. But if in some biblical way you cut the process short without being biblical, you will lack the spiritual endurance the trial was designed to produce. Listen to that again. If in some biblical way you cut the trial short on your own, you will lack the spiritual endurance the trial was designed to produce. And at the moment you need that strength, you will find yourself incomplete, end quote. That's the key thing. The thing that's so important, you guys, we're supposed to be doing this on our own. But if we keep cutting the trial short, if we keep not trying to do what we're supposed to do in humility to the Lord, we're not going to be building the muscles we need. we're not going to be building that muscle. And then when the time comes when we need it, we don't have it. So that's why trials are supposed to be looked at as good by us, not bad, but God is definitely always using them to show us the validity of our faith. Not to say that, oh, we're not a Christian because we got sad. No, that's definitely not what I'm meaning by that. But once we realize that God is just strengthening our faith through trials, we're like, wow, God's totally involved in my life. And that's exciting. Because if we know God is involved in our life and we really are learning how to want the will of God, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Psalm 119, one more verse out of Psalm 119, verse 67. Psalm 119, 67. The writer says, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. Amen. That's what happens. That's what happens. Okay, so in that chapter of J. Adams, Consider It All Joy, Controlling Our Thinking, the next chapter we're going to get is Temptation. And that to me is phenomenal. But we'll go through that. But let me read you this poem by Amy Carmichael, because sometimes things can be so hard. And I get that. I'm not saying that if you think it's hard, I'm not beating up on you, because look, I get it hard all the time. So I don't want to do that. But for Amy Carmichael, who had so many things she went through in her life, in fact, toward the end of the last 20 years of her life, Amy Carmichael lived her life in bed. She was bedridden. How? She was a missionary to India. She was walking on her porch, and she apparently, her leg fell in a hole on the porch or something like that, and she broke her leg. But she says this, when she's trying to talk to people in her mind that don't truly love Christ the way they're supposed to. She has this poem called Hast Thou No Scar? And here, I'm just going to say it to you. She writes, hast thou no scar, no hidden scar, on foot or side or hand? I hear thee sung as mighty in the land. I hear them hail thy bright ascendant star. Hast thou no scar? Hast thou no wound? Yet I was wounded by the archers, spent, leaned me against a tree to die, and rent by ravaging beasts. I swooned. Hast thou no wound? No wound? No scar? Yet as the master is, so shall the servant be. And pierced are the feet that follow me. Yet thine are whole. Can he have followed far, who has no wound or scar? You know what? I know you got some wounds. I know you got some scars, obviously, if you're a believer, which I believe you are. But it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. The Lord Jesus Christ is doing a lot through your life, in your life. He's making you a brighter Christian. Maybe to those people around you who don't know the Lord, or maybe they're saved, but they're disobedient. I don't know. Just throwing it out there. God is always doing 1,000 things in everything that he does, most of which you and I know nothing about. We talked about that last time.